Hi, this is Privateer Station, and today we're bringing you day 547 of Russian invasion into Ukraine. As always, with former advisor to the office of the President of Ukraine, Lieutenant Colonel Alexey Arestovych, and this time with Russian investigative journalist Yulia Latynina. They usually meet every Thursday every week, so these conversations sometimes deep dive into current news with the flair of historic events and things and experiences that humanity should have learned from the past. Special thanks go today to PSH and Anhill, and of course to Bill. Thank you for your super thanks. And with this, here's day 547. Enjoy. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. This is Yulia Latynina and Alexey Arestovych, and as it often happens on Thursdays, we're doing our stream. Yes, hello, and happy holiday. Right, indeed, it's Ukrainian holiday today. So Putin gave Ukraine a big present today for the day. Right, and I have no doubts that in about 2 to 3 weeks, Prigozhin will be found by Russian investigators to be some Ukrainian agent, and everybody will understand in Russia why was he shot down. I actually have some interesting details about how he was shot down, which sound a little fantastic. He and his whole team were actually flying to Putin in his Valdai residence. And since every flight to Valdai goes through St. Petersburg residence, they actually flew through from Africa on a military jet. Then they changed and embarked on these two jets, and they flew over Valdai. That's where they have 4 S-300s stations deployed. They covered at least 40 miles around the area, and of course they didn't reach the place. They fell about a dozen miles away from their destination. So, yeah, in order to assassinate somebody, you need to know where the person will be, and one of the old ways to do that is to invite them to meet. Yeah, speaking of victims, right? Yeah, indeed, there are 10 people dead, and I think it matches the number of aviators they shot on the way to Moscow when they were marching to Putin, Kremlin. And by the way, people are saying that one of the stewardess was a sister of one of the prosecutors of one of the regions in Russia. But when Putin bothered with these details, I think it's sort of a gift to military for the airplanes that Prigozhin people shot down. Putin shot down Prigozhin's jet. Well, okay, so on this angle, by the way, you can actually see who ordered that, because it's only FSB who could track who boarded which plane, so they needed to have eyes everywhere. But S-300 is a military system, so only military can use that, and only one person can order the joint operation by these two agencies. And I know you discussed that with Romanenko yesterday, right, Yulia? And this is the best proof that it is not FSB or not military. This is a joint operation between two, and only the general commander of the country can combine the efforts of these two specialists. So this is where the trace leads. All right, so one quick ask, please do not forget to click subscribe, like button, and the bell if you haven't done that yet. And of course, leave a comment or ask a question. So going back to our topic, of course, I heard your discussion about Prigozhin and things that were happening to him. You know, when I heard all the news about him falling from the sky, I remembered about Machiavelli, when Cesare Borgia got rid of his condottiers, and Machiavelli was saying it was a wonderful strategy. And what Cesare Borgia did, it was back in the day, it was Renaissance times, right? It was still the echoes of knighthood, some considerations of honor. And after condottiers had an uprising against Cesare Borgia, he invited them to one of the castles. They came there, they were captured, and in a few days they were beheaded. Yeah, right? Red wedding, as the Soviet Union used to do. The same archetype. And the fantastic feature of that is that everybody knows about that. It's a part of a culture in many books and movies and everywhere, and yet it repeats over and over again. People fall for that. They believe that there can be some guarantees, that they can trust their leader against whom they rebelled. So, like in that saying, Billy was weak, Billy was silly, now Billy is dead. I actually think the ancient societies, they knew how to negotiate. And even that Cesare Borgia story, despite Machiavelli's praise, it ended real bad for him because people learned that nobody can come to any agreement with him, that he will not hold his word. The same thing will happen to Putin just a bit later. It's a longer term in this case, I think. Okay, going back to Putin in this case, I think in the tactical level, he indeed reinforced his status of an alpha in Russia. He demonstrated everybody that he controls things. And just as we mentioned that in these operations, they need to have joint effort from FSB and the army in order to shoot the plane down with S-300. So he did underscore that tactically, Putin has won. Indeed, Yulia, but he has lost strategically, because out-of-court execution of 10 citizens of Russian Federation using 2 enforcement agencies of Russian Federation doesn't add him any score as the government figure. He added himself a score as a mafia, as the head of the mafia in Russia, sure, but strategically he lost. He lost strategically on the 23rd of August. And he just outlined that he is the head of Russian mafia, which mafia is essentially corruption between the government body and criminality, and that's what he outlined with his actions. Alexey, I think after Bucha event, Prigozhin's liquidation will change much for him, right? It may maybe just reinforce the gang, so they would be afraid to run in different directions. No, Yulia, I don't think his gang will be afraid to run. In order to do that, what he did with Prigozhin, he needed to find, first of all, different people who would point him in the right direction for all the secrets and monies that Prigozhin was in control of. Usually these are people on the 3rd or 5th lines of command of the same organization. And he could negotiate with these people, basically pointing finger at Prigozhin, saying, these guys don't know when to stop, you guys are smarter, you will be leading everything, these are just gone a little mad, and the motherland will remember you. So they likely strike an accord. And when you agree upon things, it's always a dual-sided process. So first of all, whoever is now stepping into Prigozhin's shoes, they know that it's impossible to really fairly agree with Putin. He will not hold his word. On the other hand, they know that they're taking the shoes of the leader whom they betrayed. So if you think, if one thinks that for a while this will strengthen his organization, that Wagner will become stronger, it won't. And it doesn't really add any score to Russia as a country as well. If you look at it from the higher level, at first they allowed for a military mutiny from an organization that is being funded better and richer than Russian military. This organization marches towards Moscow, captures the military command. Along the way, president and government flee the capital. On the way, these mutineers shoot down 7 aerial vehicles, jets and helicopters, and only 2 months later, they're being assassinated in and out of court proceedings. So this reminds me of mafia figuring out things between themselves. Only instead of a gun, they have a S-300 system. And Putin was always aiming to become a historic figure. No, he's just a thug. He's just a street thug. And look at the BRICS summit when China was totally dominating, and Russia managed only to turn Putin's speech, and even that they screwed up with, and they put a teleprompter audio instead of Putin's audio on this. So caused smirking of all the nations participating in that. And Russia is just outlining that they're now a thug country. They're not really a strategic partner in the world. When the head of the state is working and is getting actively involved in the anti-state activities, that is nothing to be proud of. Of course, they have some nuclear umbrella to try to protect themselves from any outside action, but this doesn't have long-term perspectives. And I frankly have a feeling of, like a soldier looking at lice. This was one of the things I wanted to say when I was outlining the similarity with Cesare Borgia events, that these things have not happened for a while in Europe. They have been happening in the East, but in Europe, in night times in Europe, these have not really happened. Well, not exactly. Wallenstein, they had similar events, and they were giving out, during peasant uprisings, they were always giving out their leaders in order to save their lives. So I think they happened just in different flavor. But yeah, sometimes even knights fail. Side note here, Alexey, that leaders of peasants' uprisings never belonged to knights or to the lords' society. So those people were okay to execute. I'm just going back to the War of White and Red Roses. I don't think they had elements like that. And, well, what about the Red Wedding? That's an exclusive situation, though. Even in Martin's book, it's it's given as a very exclusive event that is completely out of ordinary. And this is what I think differentiates feudal Europe from Chinese history. Because in Europe, this is an out of ordinary situation and event, while in China, it's a normal piece of a folklore. I was so smart, I invited people to the wedding and killed them all there. In Europe, I can only maybe pull something from Scottish history around 16th century. Yeah, I would agree. Maybe Anglo-Scottish history, they had a couple elements there, but okay. So you think the last 2 months Putin was busy buying new allies among Wagner troops and looking for additional ways to minimize compromised material and find levers to money and influence? I think actually the real owner of Wagner is not Prigozhin, it's Demin. He's a governor of Tula region in Russia. I think he is the real owner of New Wagner. And Wagner has worked as they did work before. They will not disappear. But the biography of its previous leaders, of Prigozhin and Utkin, is done in their leadership capacity and all capacities inasmuch. I think it is not so interesting, the event itself, how the whole process unfolded. More interesting, I think, that he was maybe 2 hours away from hanging Putin, and now 2 months later, Putin retaliated. That's a good lesson to the next ones. Right, to the next ones. I think there are also a couple other lessons here, Alexei. I have a feeling that Putin, with his own hands, has destroyed one of the most effective storm groups in Russian army. Actually, outside the Russian army, technically speaking. And I have a simple question. So there was Bakhmut last year. Let's imagine that Ukrainian troops, and they're maybe 20 kilometers away from Tokmak, so they might take Tokmak at the end of autumn, a bit later, so that counteroffensive would not be feasible because of the climate and the weather. And then after that, basically they cut the land route and they destroy the Crimean bridge, after which Russian group in Crimea really feels the pain. And then the next question is how to return Tokmak back. That is being posed again in front of Russian leadership. But before they used to have Wagner. Now, what can they use? Well, Wagner was more important for Russia even before that, because Wagner solves a lot of things in Africa. Wagner was helping them to earn money outside, to make money and hide money. But at the same time, I want to say that do not overemphasize Wagner. There may be 25% of battle worthiness of a normal motorized brigade. Because when people sing asanas to their military skills, that they can actually withdraw, that they can shift their effort from the flank to another flank. This reminds me that the level of Russian military right now is so low that even if you take, for example, 10,000 new recruits and give them adequate preparation that the Soviet Union motorized infantry had, they would have walked over Wagner troops and didn't even notice them. It's just on the overall background of complete decay in Russian military, Wagner is somewhat sticking out. But in general, they're not anything special, and they have no piety towards that military organization. And even if they decide to go and take Tokmak, it's a very difficult proposition to go against cluster munition types that we might be using to defend that. And it's not only because Putin destroyed Russian military. I think they grinded themselves over that war in all senses of grinding. They're not the ones they used to be back in the Soviet days. And if they stayed in military, if they stayed real army, they would not be able to take their own command outpost, right, to capture. But if so, they became some sort of mutineers, privateers, pirates, and when they become that, they cannot be considered military anymore. They cannot be used as military on the front line because there's no real control over that group. So they would not be, I think, actively involved to the same degree as they were before on the front. Plus, I think Ukraine will soon be saturated enough with different artillery measures and F-16s so that not any Wagner can change that situation. I think that page of the history was turned and nothing can be done there. Okay, then going back to Tokmak, Alexei. Do I understand correctly that Tokmak as a railroad junction is one of the main goals of Zaluzhny? And if Tokmak is taken, then one doesn't even need any Melitopol or Sea of Azov, because as we discussed last time, the war is being waged for logistics and railroad. I think what we really need is to cut the rail line between Volnovakha and Melitopol. And after that, they won't be able to hold that defense. Because, as you said, how far is it? 60 kilometers of steppe to the mouth of Crimea? And it's really hard to hold it because it's nothing there. There's nothing to hide behind. All that plus the Crimean bridge, right? Yeah, of course. Crimean bridge is another condition and something will happen to that. It will not survive this war. And that's it. It's a very cul-de-sac story for Putin in the south. It's a dead end for them. It's all decided. It's really just a matter of months and some tactical work that needs to be done. Strategically, it's been all decided. I'm also looking at the competition between military intel and security services of Ukraine. Because Maluk just came out and said that it is us who destroyed the Crimean bridge because Russian side is always thinking about military intel instead. And to not be in the shadows, Budanov came out after that S-400 destruction in the northwest of Crimea. I remember it's a very expensive thing, right? It's like $1 billion. No, billion is for the whole battery. This was just one element of that. And there was another radio interference system, Prelot, that was destroyed. And after that, there was a naval descent of military intel and destroyed some more objects. What? You're telling me that it was special Marines who came out and destroyed the objects? Yeah, that's what is being discussed in Ukraine. They landed, they destroyed things, and they left. So now they indeed have a big hole in the defense, in the aerial defense of Crimea. And big holes are not done for nothing. Somebody will fly through that hole into their territory, and this is what military operations are done for. All these special services of military intel and the like are designed to carry out operations like that. That's their direct objective. And yeah, by the way, they also stole a helicopter, right? That Chervinsky failed to do. Well, yeah, we did. What about details? Well, the details are online. Details are on the internet. I don't know all of them. The guy flew to our Ukrainian landing coordinates and landed, and we've been waiting for them. And he was actually bringing spare parts for Su-30s for some jets, and 2 people aboard were killed. Right. Only the pilot knew the plan. When the others figured out that they're on Ukrainian territory, they tried to resist, and as armed military, if they don't surrender, it's being destroyed. So they were destroyed. By the way, what do you think about attempt of Chervinsky? I think he was trying to do the same, steal the jet. I don't know details about it. I don't have facts about that event. I think we'll learn more about what he was actually trying to do. I actually heard different opinions about Chervinsky as a professional, and I can say that, in my opinion, acting colonels of security service of Ukraine shouldn't be diving into politics too far, shouldn't be on television much. And before the war, he was really digging deep into things related to Wagner. And I cannot say that he was truly objective, given what I know about that. So I would call it the subject of discussion topics, of hygiene for discussion topics. Okay, going back to Wagner, what seems to me one of the main lessons of what happened yesterday is that there is a political dimension to that, right? Putin was always trying to scare the West, that if not me, there'll be some Strelkov, Prigozhin with his sledgehammer. Russian people are dark, they don't take democracy ever. I'm barely holding them here. And what we learned yesterday is that not a single one was loud about the event. Strelkov was arrested. Nobody really protested. There was quiet. A couple of people came out, but that's it. Prigozhin was shot down visually to make a real statement. Nobody and nothing. There is no enthusiasm about Putin's war. Everybody is just sitting and waiting for the time when he will lose it. That's what he destroyed. The fear that there are some dark forces that Russian people might join, that it will be even darker than Putin. Russian troops are being accused in being imperial all the time, but I think the main characteristic of Russian people is their complete complacency. I think if they'll be told to be Democrats, they'll be Democrats. If they'll be told to be fascists, they'll be fascists. If they're told to be imperialists, they'll be imperialists. And it's a very small group that happened to happen up top at the leadership, due to very specific features of Russian society, is using that factor, that historic factor of Russia, that there is a need for people, I guess it's one of the features, to gather around Tsar, even if it's not a real human, if it's just a painted stake in the ground. If they're happy, if they're lucky, they may get a good Tsar. If they're not lucky, they will get Stalin, Putin, and all that nightmare. And then there may be some Brezhnev who will probably they take as a gift, as a good luck. But a total inability and lack of responsibility for their own destiny is one of the main features of current Russian society, I think. And the fact, if somebody was hoping that they will be running to aid Prigozhin, it's not about Russians these days. Yeah, they took some pictures with him, they waved, they played some songs, but that's about it. That's all they can do in their current condition, unfortunately. I think any peoples in a dictatorial style like Putin, most peoples will not be able to do anything. Well, yeah, same Americans who threw tea in 1776. The last 2 years, they were walking in masks, obeying the overall leadership who told them to stay at home and wear masks. So it's not just about Russian society, I think. Probably, but I wanted to outline here that Putin is saying that Russians never take democracy. That's a failed statement because whoever comes next will be able to lead them in different directions. They'll just as much follow as they're doing now. There will not be much resistance to open society, democratic processes, and everything. So they'll build those and they'll follow. I think overall evolutionary situation is not dead end for Russians. They just need a different leadership. So when people are discussing Wagner, I always keep being amazed that Putin, who wants to control everything, who only probably doesn't control those people who bake pastries, but other than that, he wants to control everything, creates huge monopolies and gives them to his friends, all of a sudden creates a big private military company, which reminds, I think, the times of 30-year war in Europe when Wallenstein was there, and we know how it ended. Otherwise, it's not really a tradition in Europe. So I have a question. What did he have in his head when he created this company, first of all, and second, gave leadership of this organization to a psychopath? Let's be honest here. A person who really wanted to get there, who wanted to show Putin that he deserves that. We won't even talk about his criminal background when he was prosecuted for strangling a girl or attempt to kill a girl for a failed attempt to steal her earrings or something. But even, with the newspapers, when Putin's allies were trying to suppress free media, when they were injecting people with different poisons, when they were beating them and killing them otherwise. And that was back in the Novaya Gazeta times when they discovered some of their Putin spies and activists among themselves. And they actually came out to President's administration and said, what, are these your people who are trying to kill us? And President's people answered back, administration said, no, that's not us. This is somebody who wants to serve us and who wants to be overzealous and just show how much they support us and hopefully get something. But this is not us directly. So as a result of that, he puts Prigozhin, a psychopath who is being hated by his own surroundings, as a head of the military company, private military company, and just fall into the pit of violence and losing the monopoly for violence for the government. Well, I think it's clear though, Yulia. If your surroundings hate that, that's good. You need to scare them. He likes to cut heads off? Sure. Who else do you need in Africa? People who want to follow the laws of Russian Federation or international laws? When he needs to deal with different juntas, some of which are actually show some signs of cannibalism traditions, and then also somebody wild enough to control all these uranium mines. So their style was, execute, put the head in a spike, and scare everybody. Plus, I think Prigozhin in Africa was not really military leader. I think he was more logistics and monetary leader, but all the military operations was more probably Utkin, who was the leader. And Prigozhin was not planned to be used in this conflict. The Wagner troops, they were not brought from the beginning. They were brought in, I think, in March 16th, when Russia has already failed in their campaign. I remember what was happening. I was in the part of that negotiations group. By the middle of March, they already withdrew a bunch of these denationalization, the militarization, denazification requests. They understood they were in a difficult position. And that's when they brought Wagner. That could solve at least something on the front, on the background of complete defeat of Russian military and failure to achieve any goals. And one also needs to consider that people do change. A man with 10 million is one thing. A man with 200 million in his bank account is another. A man with 2 billion, that's a whole other situation. And, people lose their bearings left and right when exposed to that risk. Did I ever tell you how I was a Ukrainian bureaucrat for a while, the head of one of the regions? So I was offered to be there while another person could not carry out his responsibilities. So I stayed in that position for a month. And you know what's an interesting thing I observed? A month later, just a month in this role, I could see, my shoes changing into a more fashionable design. I got a special man purse with stuff, and my belly started to grow, and I got some very interesting notes in the way I talk to certain people. And it's like Romata Istorsky in Difficult to Be a God, when he slowly was turning into one of the lords on the planet while he was just a scientist exploring. And this is just a smaller level bureaucrat, that does affect you, that tries to affect you. I was noticing it, so I was controlling it. But if you are drinking with military leaders, and you can have Putin on a call and you can ask certain things, and Putin will actually follow your ask, and he'll tell others to stand down because you are somewhat useful, you're winning battles for him in Syria, in Africa. I think he could have lost his bearings back then. And the fact that he was sadist and psycho, whom else can Putin give his African toys, where you indeed need to cut heads in order to be feared? So I think that's all logical. And after that, they let him loose a little. And they needed somebody to be a counterweight for military. And they were supporting or letting Prigozhin go to as far as he did. And you could see how he was shooting at the portraits of his troops, were shooting at the portraits of Gerasimov and Shoigu, using them as targets. And then later, of course, next step would be to march to Moscow, and that's what he did. Well, another thing that I cannot really wrap my head around is that in the country where economy is so poor that one could definitely dedicate more time to putting asphalt on the roads, actually building more roads, fixing buildings, making sure your industrial capacity is good. Why are we talking about these bloody diamonds? Why even go to Africa? For example, where is Sergey Brin and Elon Musk, and where are bloody diamonds in comparison with that? Which Warren Buffett would be dealing with these bloody diamonds because they're so not competitive on the global market, and one needs to invest a lot in developing that mine area. And also, in the end, you get a much lesser output than if you develop Yandex, let's say, as a competitor to Google. Well, Yulia, they were doing what they can. They were doing whatever is within their purview, what they can do. I also do not understand how you could earn, 13 billions, trillions to the budget in the last 13 or 20 years and still have not settled Mars or built a base on the moon. They were doing what they can do. Run around, agree with gangsters, share money. He was doing that back in the days in St. Petersburg trade port, and he was basically milking businessmen together with criminals to share the proceeds. He doesn't see that. He doesn't understand these perspectives. He won't even understand that. By the way, speaking of Musk, he recently came out and said that he indeed talked to Putin in spring, and all his tweets appeared not because he was philosophizing on the subject, but because Putin was riding his ears for a while. Even that poses a lot of questions, but we do value Musk not for that, right? Well, yeah, we try to romanticize these big figures, but at the end, they're effective in what they do only. Musk can build industries. Putin can steal money. And in order to be a real leader, a real historical leader, of course, one needs to be a sacrificial figure. You need to forego personal luxuries, and you need to work on the big schemes and big global projects, big global ideas. So Putin did a little bit of reforms at the beginning, maybe the first 3 to 4 years of his leadership, and after that he was ruling as like a czar. And those people who know Kuchma, our first president in Ukraine, are saying the same thing. He tried real well for the first 5 years, and after that he went down the slope. And we know how it ended with Maidan and Yanukovych, and then him fleeing Ukraine. So why Africa? There's a lot of money there. There's a lot of money that can be owned, that are not controlled by global interests at the moment. And one wants to have money that are not controlled by any America or anything, and also to have a territory where you can hide if you want to and hide assets in. So they were using Africa as a stash, I guess. Also as a good opportunity to kick friends from Africa, from Mali, from Niger. So, friend Macron, you might want to call me again. We have more things to talk about. It's an instrument of influence on Europe. All right, so Putin is a master of bullying and thievery and criminal schemes, and not in anything productive. So if he is a master of that, he basically failed to resolve situation with Prigozhin, basically since the time when Prigozhin showed up in Popasna and started to show his ambitions publicly. And even later, when he started flying helicopters to Russian prisons and get together more troops for the front. And Putin was quiet all the time. And he was Prigozhin was flying those helicopters from one prison to another and was trying to fortify his position as the future possible leader of Russia. And Putin was quiet on all that. He just put himself in a dead end by being so quiet. Let me tell you a story, Yulia. Actually, a real story that might topple some of the things related to this war. In Red Army, there was an 80th Tank Battalion, Tank Detachment, 90th Division. And there was a commander of the Third Battalion, Major Gerasimov. Today he is the leader of Russian military. And there was an interesting episode. They had a beautiful pine tree forest near their base. One day they discovered that all the pine trees are painted with white at the bottom. And the commander comes there and says, who's responsible for that? So he calls up Gerasimov, people pointed fingers at Gerasimov and said, that's his people. And he calls upon him and says, so do you know that people only white paint the fruit trees? And Gerasimov looks back at him and says, isn't pine a fruit tree? That's your Gerasimov. This is the real story. This is from real life. They're idiots. These are dumb people. Do you know what the 3rd Battalion was in Red Army? Tell me more. Yeah, so the 1st Battalion was the best, smartest, brightest, or most presentable. 2nd was more of a working horse. They would be doing logistics, carrying ammo, fixing roads, fixing barracks. And 3rd was a nightmare. So the worst ones were there. All the political were exiled to the 9th and to the 3rd Battalion, to the 9th subdivision. So the commander of that 3rd Battalion painted the pine trees white. And speaking of the doctrine, they had a Colonel Kvachkov, who was also not too bright. He listened to the speech of Kennedy in 1962, who said, why do you neglect special forces? Look how Cuban partisans took power. We can do the same, and we should be fortifying and strengthening our special operations. So Kvachkov basically took Kennedy's speech, added a little bit, added it to his PhD and special diploma that he was defending, and Kvachkov actually invented that special military operation, the whole term. And Gerasimov, upon reading that or figuring that out from one of his relations with Kvachkov, figured how to do the hybrid warfare related to that. So these are the idiots who are given $10 billion over 10 years to figure how to wage this war. They can't even take your pain. So Putin needed somebody who can do at least something basic on the front. And he turns to the ones who had some positive experience, for example, in Sudan. And over there, gold mines were guarded by Wagner. And fighting with locals, they used inmates very much in Sudan. So they were inmates from Sudan? Yeah, in Sudan, they used Sudanese inmates to fight against their enemies locally and to help them protect their gold mines. Prigozhin said, look, this technology works, and Putin gave him carte blanche to violate Russian constitution and Russian laws because that works. That worked in Sudan. And it worked for them because before that, they took Popasna with the main core of Wagner, and they had tremendous losses, and Prigozhin didn't like that. And he told Putin that you still need my people because they're the ones getting you gold and diamonds from Africa. You need to use inmates like we did in Sudan. And that's how it started, and they're still fighting the remnants of that effort in some parts of the front. Storm Z and the like. And they had similar experiences in Syria and others. So Prigozhin and Wagner were somewhat notable on the front because the rest are freaking dumb. They're so dumb that even Wagner looks fantastic on their background. And that's it. You know, as a civilian, you understand a lot of features, but you don't have the systemic understanding from within the system. Any professional military who is looking at the circus that was happening, that was unfolding in front of our eyes, understands how everything is tremendously neglected, the degree of decay with all the things. Teplinsky, for example, he was referred as the hero of Russia and as a brain of army. I don't know, maybe a spinal cord brain or a bone marrow. Because when he had a conflict with Gerasimov, people were discussing about that in the chats. When they were praising him, they said he gave two important advices: to dig deep and to make sure there is communication between the fortified areas. That's a real general, that's a real brain, right? These are two basic assumptions that one would think are obvious, right? You understand how important these advices are. You're a philologist, right, by education, Yulia? Yes. It's basically to... Somebody from a doctorate panel gave advice to an aspirant who is basically writing his paper to get a PhD. They would give an advice that in Greek alphabet there are two different letters O. Don't forget about it. So that's the level of advice. And that's why not just Prigozhin, any sergeant who had a proper training would be looking very genius on the background of these Russian military generals. So that's all the secret they had. He just could do something and could show some results. They actually did take Lysychansk and Severodonetsk, Popasna and Bakhmut, and Solidar. Yeah, they had 120,000 dead and wounded, but, you know, they at least got some territory for regional centers. And he at least managed to do something. And he was giving carte blanche to do more. And he was getting bolder and bolder. And then he requested more arms and the best equipment, because otherwise I cannot guarantee. And Putin became a hostage, I think, of his own idiotic operation when he needs to demonstrate at least some successes. Yes, he did have an instrument like Wagner that was trying to achieve that. But even that instrument, the whole army, the whole Putin, is just trash. It's just endless trash. And that's all the romanticized story of this campaign. I think the ancestors will shyly walk away from this topic. If Russia still has any historic future in its destiny, and they'll be good people, they will be shying away from this page of history. I have another question about stupidity of this campaign. Everybody is surprised. They were waiting that Ukraine will be getting a lot of good Western arms, long-range missiles, jets, and they will be advancing same as Americans did in Iraq. That didn't happen, and people are discussing why it didn't happen and why they were not given all that. And then I understood that there is another just as interesting question, that Russia had all that. They had 6,000 long-range missiles that they produced before, and I think they wasted all of them mostly on Ukrainian infrastructure, and they, for the most part, were manufactured before this war. They had 1,000 of jets that existed before this war. And I have a question, so why Russia did not start this war in the same style as Americans did in Iraq. Why, during several weeks, 6,000 missiles, because they usually say that missiles go in, Ukrainian jets flew to a different airfield to not be hit. And I think it's obvious. I think Iraqi jets did the same thing. The second day they were doing the same, third day. But after a week, Iraqi jets had nowhere to go. And sorry for that long-winded question. I want to understand people to understand this surprise side of that situation. When Putin could, during several weeks, destroy Ukrainian military infrastructure with missiles, and he would have succeeded if he even tried, and then use the jets to finish and polish the rest, and then move the armor, not in the way they did on the highways, but in a wide front, just like Americans did in Iraq. Yulia, do you know why General Beseda, the head of the 5th Department of FSB, is still in prison in Russia? Right, because he did say that you will be greeted with flowers in Ukraine. So they failed to judge the enemy in Ukraine. They thought of a different campaign. They were bringing their parade uniforms with them. They brought their armored columns when they had only 50% of fuel on board. They were not preparing for real war. And Simonyan did spill a little bit about that at the beginning. One of their propagandists said that what's that, Ukraine? Maybe 2 to 3 days, that's it. And that's the mark, that's the grade they gave to themselves as a system, who completely failed to gauge us in connection with reality. These guys are not in connection with any reality. That's how they do everything. How you do one thing, you do all your things. That's how they landed Moon 25 system. That's how they captured Popasna. That's how they're doing operation in Ukraine. That's, I think, how they're doing things in Africa. It's just we do not have high definition, high visibility on the details of that. They're just dumb. They're dumb as a wood. The resources they had that could be used to a much better degree and create so many problems for us that we would probably not be able to survive. But we have what we have, and the story cannot be rolled back. People always believe that there are some genius, evil masterminds are ruling them. But when the number of stupidity just goes beyond the explainable level of stupidity, this is not, I understand it's hard to believe, but they're just idiots. All that gang, all that company that rules Russia is just a gang of idiots. There is no black swan behind them, or black order like in Don Rebbe in Hard to Be God. These are people who've been spitting in the neighbor's soup and stealing each other's property. That's all what it is. There is nothing. Evil is very banal. People think that the devil is so cunning, so smart, like in Devil's Advocate. So he is capable of doing everything on a super high level. No, evil and devil are very banal. This is the secret of evil. This is very primitive evil. What needs to be in the head of people who are bringing their parade uniforms to a special military operation? Before that, their war lasted with Ukraine for about 8 years. There was already a military conflict for 8 years. You could already gauge what might likely happen. But even that didn't click. Only one note here, Alexey, that right now Russian army, I think, have learned something. Yulia, these are stories. These are fairy tales of Viennese forest. They didn't really learn much. They still throw meat. Yeah, well, they started digging themselves in. Yeah, right, they learned how to dig trenches. But it will end sadly for them anyway. It's already in the ending phase of it. How dumb you have to be to try to losing on the south, knowing that this is the direction of the main strike, that's where strategic success will happen. Throw 100,000 in Kupiansk-Svatovo direction. What did they want to fight in those forests? Throw 900 tanks in the forest? They can't even go through. These people are idiots, Yulia. There is no learned and became better. These are all mythology. They haven't really learned anything. But they dig trenches. Well, you don't have to be smart to dig trenches. Looking at the gigantic losses that Ukraine is suffering, Yulia, no, we're not suffering gigantic losses. We're suffering some losses, but we're losing less than during other episodes of this war. There were episodes when we suffered much higher losses than we are now. So there's no brain. It's that's the situation, as the Russian saying goes, the man got wiser not by his wits, but by his smacked ass. Don't look for any strategic ideation or great ideas there. These are reflexes. They all ride on reflexes. On reflexes, you can teach a bear to bike or a hare to smoke. And that's what they learned. Extreme dressage. So speaking of reflexes, why even hit Kupiansk up front when they could possibly use Russian territory to hit from the flank? Well, you can ask the 2nd and Kantemirovskaya and Tamanskaya divisions why they're not doing that. Maybe because we have some fortifications, or why they're not doing it. Or maybe their military thought decided that since Ukrainians hit us out of Kupiansk this way, we should do the same thing in the opposite direction. No words. This system works with a negative selection. So don't look for anything special there among people that are leading that system. During war sometimes positive selections shows up. But I think all that positive selection was cancelled by Shoigu recently after the mutiny. Okay, changing topic suddenly. You posted your reading your voiceover of Heinlein, Starship Troopers. In this book, there's actually an interesting element where the voters are the ones who served in military, right? What I was thinking about is that right now people think that democracy and elections are owned by everybody. I would remind that in the ancient times in Greece, for example, Athenian Greece, the voters were the ones who could fight, who were fighting for the country. The same basis was in the foundation of Roman Republic. And regardless, during hundreds and maybe thousands of years, humanity was set in a way that the rulers were the ones who were waging wars, with very few exceptions. And the difference between democracy and feudalism was that if you have mass wars with infantry and cheap weapons, then you have a democracy. But when you have knights that wear expensive armor and you need a couple villages to supply a couple knights, then you have a feudal society. I was thinking that modern democracy, including the West, when they lost their military bases, they start doing some surprising tricks. I really like Israeli democracy personally, because it matches with the original definition of democracy. Everybody are part of Israeli military, everybody have compulsory military service, and people who make decisions are the ones who actually fought on the battle or have been part of the military, and many of them will be fighting on the front if things go south. And right now, in most countries, it happens so that some people are making decisions and others will be fighting for them. What do you think? Well, first of all, our societies became a little bigger than Greece polices, Greece towns of ancient Greece. Back then, everybody knew each other, and now it's a representative democracy through other people. Second, I don't think I'm reading Heinlein not because he expresses all the right ideas, but I think it's a basic book for military. And I wanted our society to think about a few ideas that are expressed in these books. Perhaps during military times, things will change a little. I don't think that the voters should only be people who served or fighting in the military. I think we can also look into the future. You don't need to be always looking in the past. And we need to be selecting the proper system of administration and societal system to match the problems we're facing currently. And if democracy has drawbacks, huge drawbacks, right, of course. And what is the right way to vote? It's probably not the right question for the last 2 minutes of the stream. Let's record a separate show and talk about a separate stream and talk about what democracy could look like. What does effective democracy look like? And I think that's a wonderful note. Let's end on this, and we will do another stream and dedicate it to this topic. This was Yulia Latynina, Alexey Arestovych, and I think it was wonderful. Thank you, and see you later.